Nasser Ahmed stood in the Delphic battlement, watching the horde gathering, horizon to horizon. There were far too many to make out any details through the dust, but that didn't stop him from staring. A black smear of innumerable foes, coming together for the last battle. It wouldn't be long now. Several officers came and went, bearing mute witness to the massing of impossible forces to the north, east, and south. Emmett acknowledged them with nods or grunts of greeting, but his focus was reserved for the horde out in the wasteland. Out of his brethren, only Zephon lingered nearby. Either Zephon didn't know him well enough to recognize when he wished to be left alone, or simply didn't care. Either way, Emmett kept staring at the horde, his eyes drifting in a slow, endless scan. "What do you seek out there?" Zephon asked. "Nothing, I'm just looking." "I think not." There was a cold serenity radiating from the other Blood Angel, one Emmett hadn't noticed before. Zephon had been hot-blooded before his injuries years ago, and in miserable company indeed when he'd been crippled. Now he emanated a chill that was more than simple stoicism. Some new resolve since he'd made his way out of the Rizvazi bastion and back to the surface. "You are plagued, Nasir, I can tell." Earlier in the retreat, Emmett kept staring. "I saw Cargos out there. I cut his throat." Zephon tested a hand on his brother's pauldron. The two of them had never been close, even before Zephon's exile to Terra. But Emmett and his time with the 12th Legion pits was legendary among the Blood Angels. A dubious legend, admittedly, but a legend nonetheless. "I'm sorry, Emmett. Perhaps it is useless to say, but you did what you had to do." Emmett spared him a glance. "I'm not sure I did. They were traitors. There's no redemption for them. Not for any of them. Not after all this." "That's not what I'm saying. I don't think I killed him." 5 kilometers to the east, with the sutures at his throat still leaking sluggish, clotting blood, a warrior held Card's salvaged axe and leaned against the hull of a mangled, mutating land raider. He stared at the distant walls of the Delphic battlement and radiated a wounded animal's sense of hatred. His breathing came in wheezing drags, with his psychology still adjusting to the battlefield tech, flesh fused to the hole where his vocal cords had been. There was hate in his eyes, which was no surprise to any of the warriors near him, but there were also tears. Some thought this was pathetic. Others understood implicitly. Another warrior approached him. This one was clad in scarred, rune-marked black, and responsible for the fact that the other still lived. "You should rest. The battle begins at dawn." "No!" The world eater shook his head, voice recognizably his own, but ragged with mechanical reconstruction. "Fine, here." "What are you gazing at, my friend?" asked Inzar. Cargos hacked a cough with his new throat. His voice emerged from his mouth with a buzzsaw rasp. "The enemy." She woke when the ship called to her. It didn't speak exactly. It pleaded in a voice of metal under tension, waking her with a protest of tormented steel. Lotara sat up in bed, hearing something of her name in the groaning of the Conqueror's bones. "Fox! Bridge, this is Saren. Status report." "Fox, damn it, establish bridge link. This is the captain. Status report." The ship shuddered again, but the Fox stayed dead. It wasn't a gunnery shudder. It wasn't an impact shake. She knew her ship's tremors. It was yet more of the warp's pressure out there, mangling the hull as it tried to get in. "Lights!" Lights, illumination. Oh, bloody hell. This achieved exactly as much as their attempts to activate the box. Latara didn't have the energy for this. She didn't have the energy for anything. She was skeletal with malnutrition and dehydration, and even with paltry anger, threatening to leave. She hailed her attendant servitor with a weak wave of hand. Dress me! Uniform! The servitor, who had once been Consul Officer 4th Class Isabetta Raham, before her regrettable attempt at mutiny in the starvation riots last month, wasn't standing in its usual place by the sealed window. It was slumped against the wall, demotivated to use the Mechanicum technology. And, to use Saren technology, dead as shit. Latara peered at it through the darkness. Half of its shaved head had merged with the iron wall. The thing's cranium was swollen, spread out, blood vessels threading the dark metal. Judging by the expression on the servitor's face, Latara had slept through its screaming. The captain wasn't sorry to have missed that, though she wondered just how long she'd been out, and how deeply she'd been asleep to miss such a thing in her own quarters. The blast shield over her viewing window was up, letting in the useless unlight of the warp outside. It rippled, that non-light, those colors that never made anything any easier to see. It pooled and puddled and ran on the surfaces of her chambers. She sealed the window before she slept. She was certain of it. Shipboard Kron! She called out, expecting no answer. Nothing worked anymore. Nothing had worked for months. Fine, I'll dress myself. She reckoned she could do with it without help. Probably it would take a while, and she doubted she could lace up her boots with her shaking fingers, but Latara hauled herself out of bed and gave a weak laugh. She didn't need any help getting dressed anyways. She slept in her uniform again. It was crumpled and dirty, but it was practically parade clean next to the blood-stained rags many of the crew wore on duty these days. Latara looked at her bedside table, where her canteen stood half full, along with several foil-wrapped ration wafers, but her throat tightened at the sight. Despite her weakness, she wasn't hungry. Despite her thirst, she didn't think she could face swallowing even a mouthful of water. The ship shivered again, and its grinding bones mumbled her name. The Conqueror wanted something from her. She couldn't guess what that might be. When it wasn't trying to please her by dragging back dead crew to haunt her, it was demanding she do something, without clarifying what. Latara rose on her unsteady legs and made her way to the door. She heard a scream outside, coming from deeper in the ship, but the corridor outside her chambers was empty. Not so long ago, that would have made her skin crawl. She rubbed her aching temples and started walking towards the rapid transport elevator. Karn was on the bridge. He stood by her command throne, up on the raised dais, beneath a swarm of malformed brass gargoyles that hadn't been up there before. Latara looked up at the hideous things, sculpted to cling from the steel beams, leering down at the bridge crew. Their childlike bodies were mangled, together in a hive-like mass of embrace, and their many mouths stood open to show rows of saw-blade teeth. They looked like they were ready to drag members of the bridge up to the ceiling in their greedy little hands, and from the blood-stains on their brass fangs, Latara suspected many had already befallen that fate. They didn't move as she stared at them. Maybe they wouldn't move at all. She hesitated to look at Karn. He wouldn't say anything. He never did. Because he was dead, and he wasn't there. Instead, she ascended the dais, looking over the skeleton crew still operating the bridge. Several hundred souls had toiled here at the Great Crusade's height. Attrition, war, time, and the axes of their own legion had dwindled that number down to threadbare dozens. Corpses lay across the deck where they'd fallen, while most respectfully treated were piled in loose mounds against the chamber walls. The freshest of the dead were only a few days into their decay, ripening with discoloration, beginning to bloat, attracting fat, shiny flies. Plenty of the others were in states of deeper rot, slowly collapsing in on themselves, dry and sunken like unearthed mummies. Lotara smelled it, really smelled what the conqueror had become. The rank copper of blood was nothing new. It was a smell practically boiled into the warship's bones. But now it was coated with the spoiled meat stink of biological corruption. Almost everyone knew the scent of decaying animal flesh, and it was easy to read romancer prose about the reek of war. But something in the human genetic strain rebelled at the smell of rotting people. Lotara's weakened insides coiled up at the richest of that smell. She didn't just breathe it in. It seeped inside of her. The smell was part of the ship, part of her uniform, part of her skin and hair, part of the blood that beat through her body. She had a faint fear she would carry this stink inside her for the rest of her life, just waiting to be acknowledged whenever she let herself take those deepest breaths. The oculus was open, looking out at the choked spear of Terra. Pyrokinetic madness thrashed in orbit around the globe. Colors with no names danced over the faces of the surviving bridge crew. None of the crew acknowledged her. They didn't even seem to acknowledge each other, staying slouched or hunched at their consoles, looking only in spurts of twitchy, tired unease. Lotara took her throne. No longer did she recline, with boots up on one armrest, as she had done in the glory days. Now, her diminished form sat crone-like in the chair's bulk. "Why is the oculus unsealed?" she called. In answer, one of the ship ratings transferred a spillage of data to the throne's projectors. The message that beamed into the air before her was the War Master himself, which Lotara suspected meant it was from Argonis, and Horus may never have even sent the order at all. There was no reason given for why all vessels were to cease closing their eyes to the warp, at least nothing past a scree of brief exhortations to seek the truth in the void's tides, and various other allusions Lotara wasn't sure she wanted to understand. She certainly wasn't going to meditate on the boiling insanity outside the window. Every sailor knew that to stare into the warp was to risk madness, and now the warp was here, buffeting the Armada in orbit and curling its tendrils around the atmosphere of Terra, changing things, warping things, one might say. It was literally the most honest way of describing it, after all. She could see faces out there in the waves. Not in the way groundlings could make out shapes in clouds, but faces, actual faces. The hollow-socketed visages of men and women she knew. Crew members no longer with her. Legionaries lost in the crusade and the rebellion that followed. She saw Ivor Tobin, her first officer, laughing without eyes, screaming without a tongue, his face the size of the moon as it twisted in the boiling morass. Then he was gone, and honestly, had he ever been there at all? Replaced by an arcing surge of empiric energy, a lashing crescent that cleaved against several of the anchored ships, and set the Conqueror shuddering. Lotara shivered in sympathy with her warship. "What word from the surface?" she called out. "Has there been any communication with the Primarch?" Not that he has been capable of speech for some time. Nevertheless, though, hope forced the ludicrous question from her lips. Again the remaining crew replied without words. Several of them keyed in commands at their stations, and a huge hollow projector of the Sanctum Imperialis flared into being in the air above the command deck. Runic signifiers showed the rough disposition of Horus's forces. The horde was mustering before the walls of the final fortress. The geography of the war's last front was deceptively simple. That was good, because it was almost over, and Lotara was tired in every way it was possible to be tired. She ached to order the ship out of orbit, setting sail for the deep void and away from all this. She could do it, couldn't she? Just raise her voice and the hololith screeched with visual static and realigned. She blinked, focused again on what lay before her. The scratchy view of the wastelands before the Delphic battlements showed hundreds of runic markers, delineating warbands and regiments and groupings of the War Master's forces. A mess too disorganized for any cohesive identity. They mustered before the vast curtain wall surrounding the Sanctum Imperialis, encircling the Delphic battlement and the final fortress that it protected. The Sanctum Imperialis was void-shielded beyond mortal comprehension and machine spirit cognition, but it was weakest in the west. That's where the Horde mustered, in great numbers. In the West Delphic archway was the wall's most heavily defended location, and its principal point of vulnerability. There the fighting would be the thickest, layered with defenders reinforcing the one grand opening in their final wall. There, the sweat of the defenders' desperation would be its bitterest, and there the blood would run deepest. Once the Horde overran the battlement, and they would, swiftly, Captain Saren hardly needed a tactical advisor to see that. It was a kilometer-long avenue, the Royal Ascension, steadily rising on stairs large enough to accommodate the tread of titans, leading to, she watched it, shimmering on the hololith. There was the Eternity Gate, the very end of the Royal Ascension, the doorway to the Emperor's castle. The Sanctum's walls couldn't be brought down. The gate could. For now it stood, facilitating the movement of soldiers and material from the Sanctum to the battlement. When the enemy broke through the battlement, though, then it would be sealed closed, denying the Horde. The final doorway. After they tore the Eternity Gate from its hinges, it would be done. This miserable war would be over, at last. Latara watched the simultaneous simulations playing out. The runes dancing their logistical dances, playing out the final act of the Emperor's end. Some of the simulations took only hours to resolve their inevitable conclusion. Several took between 1 and 3 days, and one outlier took 4. It didn't really matter. The outcome never changed. Close now, she thought, so close. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Terra once more. It was something she tried to avoid. For every time she looked upon the cradle of humanity, she was confirmed again by the fact that it was dead. Not dying, dead. Even with access to the Mechanicum's fragmented dark age of technology mastery, Terra was dead. There wasn't enough organic matter left to start a chain reaction of Terra reforming. Whole regions would be soaked in radiation for centuries to come. The last ocean, which had already been little more than a shrinking sea after the resource wars of the Age of Strife and the Emperor's unification, was now a jellied expanse of thick dust, sludge. Horus's war had destroyed Terra's last dubious claims of self-sufficiency. Latara reviewed the figures and images herself on the subscreen, with the aid of the Mechanicum Adept, noting millions of underground fungal farms and algae reservations that no longer existed, scrubbed from existence on every continent by bombardment or the invading hosts, no longer providing even a beggar's portion of sustenance required by Terra's teeming population. From the moment the Emperor launched the Great Crusade, the Throne World had fed desperately off the Imperium's new worlds. It devoured their resources with the geared jaws of the Imperial war machine, placating the citizens with glories while draining them to feed its ceaseless expansion. But if the Imperium somehow survived the last days of this war, all pretense would be gone. The parasitic fever of Terra's malfunction would be laid bare. Terra would squat at the heart of its empire, a gray cancer feeding on sacrifice, drawing in food, water, faith, iron, hope, all of it, in an endless succession, to feed the planet that wouldn't admit its time was done. These were not pleasant thoughts. She started cycling through intercepted transmissions, using the controls in the arm of her throne to scroll through the last few hours' worth of intelligence. One of them, among the latest, was marked by a scree of the Chthonian runes that caught her eye. She keyed the access code. The hololith flickered, flashed, changed, resolved. Now it gleamed an anemic blue, even less substantial, with misty figures. A gray ring of figures comprising an ethereal conclave. It took Lotara several seconds to realize what she was looking at. She knew many of these warriors, if not personally, then by sight and reputation. Fafnir Ran was there, as was Sigismund, both sparring precious minutes away from the defense of their respective bastions. They were ghosts of ghosts, hollowing into the other gathering rather than being physically present. Others were slightly clearer. The crippled Captain Zephron stood with Captain Amit and a loose line of Blood Angels leaders. Several Imperial Fists and White Scars commanders stood nearby, among a cluster of several hundred Imperial Army officers. No one smiled, no jests were told. Everyone bore witness. In the gathering's very center, the Primarch Sanguinius saw a shifting, evolving map of the inner palace. The image of the Sanctum Imperialis, Palatine district, glowed with unsteady stoicism at the hololith's heart. Lotara swore softly. She sliced in the very core of the defender's transmissions. This had come deep atop the Delphic battlement. It was the Bloody War Council at the last wall. She checked the archival data on her throne. It was scarcely half an hour old. Fascinated, she watched as the map refined itself through pitches and zooms, closing in on the Palatine Ring, the embattled bastion surrounding the sanctum itself, closing in further, splitting into cascading sub-images, bringing up wastelands of rubble and corruption between the bastions, severing off and codifying embattled regions in the periphery where significant Imperial forces still held out. This was nothing of a bigger picture, barely a slice of a slice. And this was nothing of a... How many millions of combatants were still fighting their own wars in the Outer Palace? And how many billions spread wide across the rest of Terra, waging their own campaigns? The scale of such consideration was beyond her, beyond anyone except the cognitive minds of the War Master and Roigel Dorn. But she found her thoughts drifting off into those far from the final fortress, engaged in their own life and death battles. Every one of those wars mattered as much as the assault on the Delphic battlement. For every second they held out, more of the War Master's forces were prevented from gathering. It was Dorn's final gambit. The Delphic battlement was the Sanctum's curtain wall. If that fell, there was nothing left. The way was open for the War Master to stake his claim, to walk right up to the Eternity Gate. Captain Ran! Sanguinius beckoned. The image of Fafnir Ran addressed the conclave, as Bab Bastion flared an aggravated besieged orange on the projection table. My Lord Dorn believes we can hold Bab for another 7 to 9 days, depending upon variabilities that have no bearings at this council. He has charged me to answer your request. Lord Sanguinius, as matters stand, we cannot reinforce you. You are still encircled, and cannot lift the siege. Sanguinius nodded, plainly to Lotara's eyes. He'd expected no less. Thank you, my brother, for his candor, and my thanks to you for your report. My Lord Dorn further requested that if you are able to send reinforcement to us in the defense of Bab, that you do so at once, provided it does not endanger the Delphic battlement. Sanguinius shook his head, his golden hair framing kindly. Even with the forces garrisoned here, we number scarcely 70,000. Every soul is needed on the wall. Tell my brother so, and offer him my regrets. In the Emperor's name, Ran replied, and made the sign of the Aquila over his breastplate. The hololith flickered out. The mountain of the Astronomicon gleamed a white mute with its temporary reprieve, but it was practically alone in its purity. The image of the Dark Angel, Corswain, was a scratchy and indistinct ghost of a thing, the connection savage by distance. His news was no better for the defenders. They expected a renewal of the assault on their mountain fortress any hour now. Any diminishment of their thin forces would mean the loss of the Astronomicon, reclaimed so recently and with such unlikely fortune. Lord, I will ask you nonetheless, would you have us to abandon the mountain and fight our way to you? If you order it, it shall be done. Sanguinius shook his head at the Dark Angel's offer. No, Paladin. Hold the Astronomicon at all costs. We need the beacon relit. For your very light will the 13th Legion find its way home. Corswain gave a scratchy reply, his tone hesitant. Even if Lord Gilliman and the 13th reached the system's edge this very hour, the Ultramarines would be too late to aid you. Though they will fall here, nephew, reinforcements may yet arrive in time to aid the rest of you, ensnared in your own wars. If we are foremost in your thoughts, then light the beacon to honor our memory. There could be no more fitting funeral fire. Latora swallowed at the resolve in the great angel's voice, at the acceptance. How noble he sounded, even in defeat. Next was Kishar Colosseum, endlessly reinforced by Royal Dorn, and used to house a tide of refugees from across the inner palace. On the map it gleamed a hopeless red. The Imperial Army colonel, overseeing its defenses, gave his negative report, while a field medic bandaged his face. They expected to lose the last of their ground by sunset tomorrow. Sanguinius gestured to another officer, a human commanding the Sarko Lyat concourse and its several hundred capillary avenues. Sarko Lyat was a district once home to millions of souls fortunate to live within the inner palace. Now it throbbed black with the topographic scars. It hadn't been orbital bombardment that annihilated Sarko Lyat district. It was the death of one of Horus's warships from before the ultimate wall even fell. Latora watched it die, blasted from the sky. The Legion battleship Royal Deshid had plunged through the atmosphere, picked apart by the palace's defensive guns, to no effect, smashing down and ending almost 20 million lives in the time it took to blink. More earthquakes, more dust, more of the blinding and deafening same. Another punctuation mark in the death of the planet. The army officer in charge of fighting around Sarko Lyat's ruins couldn't maintain a clean vox to the council. She sent only a brief text missive citing that her forces had no way of leaving their entrenchments and returning to the sanctum. And on it went. Every bastion, every sector, every district of the inner palace was under siege, at the heart of their own war. Most couldn't even muster a vox link at all, and those that could begged for aid that wouldn't even come. The sanctum had no way of answering any of their increasingly desperate calls for reinforcement. The defenders were locked into place. The board was set for the last moves of the game, and she stared at them, wondering why they were still there. She asked herself the very same thing. Why was she here? Why were any of them here? Why had she followed Horus in anger and into this war? Ah, but it seemed so righteous at the time, and it all seemed so necessary. World after world heaving with unfair taxation, the Emperor losing control over the Great Crusade. As adepts and ministers and bureaucrats began to assume mantles of leadership across the emerging Imperium. Not that Lotara or Primarch cared for suffering worlds, but Horus had. Horus was the best of them all. She was content being an instrument of war. Her place was to serve, to hunt, to kill. She was a blade to be wielded by righteous hands. Then the whispers had become. Peace became more than a laughably distant goal at the end of the Great Crusade. It became a distinct possibility, then an inevitability, something the humans serving the expeditionary fleets would actually live to see. What then of the legions of Astartes? What use was the perfect warrior in an age of peace? There was talk of culling, of execution, even of extermination. There were various warriors that built the Imperium with bolt gun and blade. The soldiers Lotara had served alongside for all of her adult life grew restless and uneasy. Word filtered through the Crusades' scattered fleets. Word of Terran plans, about betrayals, about treacheries whose wheels were already in motion. Word of weakness bred into gene seed. Word of a new peaceful age requiring no soldiers, no warriors, no sailors in the stars. Then what of the mortals who fought by these warriors' sides? Were they too stained? Colored by association? Would they be rewarded for their conquest of the galaxy? Or pastured off to exile worlds? There to die in the void black quiet, as the Imperium's secret shame over its bloody-handed past was made clear. Would they be destroyed upon returning to Terra, blasted out of the throne world skies as their ships returned to humanity's cradle? A similar dissolution had happened before. It was in the archives, the armies of unification, the Thunder Warriors, the host that had conquered Terra in the Emperor's name, dead, gone, slaughtered for their service to the crown. Reports of genetic instability to the Proto-Astartes conflicted with analysis that they had been executed en masse by the 10,000, the Emperor's own custodians. No one knew what to believe about any of this. Latara certainly didn't. And the Emperor, retired to Terra, refused to enlighten any of those that begged him for answers. To their pleas for truth, he returned only silence. Even when the War Master beseeched him for answers, his own son earned only cold silence. What kind of man was ruling over them? What kind of king abandoned his subjects instead of guiding them with his rule? The truth Latara could admit to herself, as she sank back to the wall, struggling to breathe in the tainted air of her twisted warship, where she'd sailed with the War Master because she wanted to. When Angron had declared for Horus, committing his legion against the Emperor, Latara swallowed her quiet doubts without much strife. What was she going to do? Praise the name of a distant monarch and turn her back on the men and women she'd bled alongside her entire life with? Abandon command of her beloved conqueror for the pathetic nobility of swearing her allegiance to a failed emperor? Horus was the Golden One, the general of generals, the war master of the Imperium. Serving him was an honor, and to be trusted by him with such a rank as hers was a pleasure that defied words. For some time, even though that would be enough, but Latara chose to sail with his forces because her life was with them. She lived and breathed for the warriors of the World Eaters Legion. For years she bled alongside them, guided them down orbit, and laid waste to worlds that defied them. She devoted her life to their principles and purpose. She respected them, loved them, and she thrived in the respect they accorded her. More than anything else, she trusted them. Them, not the Emperor. She trusted Karn and Kargos, and Angron and Horus himself. She trusted her own crew, and the other captains in her fleet. And if she were to die, let her die fighting beside those she loved and trusted. No finer fate than that. Surely, though, this was a weak exhalation. Unconvincing, even in the privacy of her own threadbare thoughts, surely. Terra turned out there, brown and gray, already dead, already choked by the poison of ambition. Yet the warped void still clutched at the globe, if there was anything left to strangle. Her mind was drifting. Disassociation brought her weakness and dehydration. She knew it well by now. Latara swallowed through the thickness of her throat, and forced her attention back to the hololith. At the end of the ad hoc council, there was no grand speech to motivate them. Sanguinius ordered the officers out into the wall to return to their forces. Maybe months ago, these human defenders might have emanated an aura of unease, or even had the consumptive marks of showing fear in their faces, but the war bleached them of such things. They were the survivors, the fortunate ones, the ones that had endured all else. They had seen and survived too much to shake in their boots now that the war was at its final wall. Something stirred inside her, something atrophied and slow, entombed in the slitty hole where her conscience used to be. It should be pathetic seeing them like this. They should stink of desperation, trapped in their last besieged fortress, all of them encircled by the War Master's horde, all of them slowly starving. It should be hilarious, listening to them begging each other for reinforcements that couldn't come. But it's not. How brave they look, driven over the edge of exhaustion, yet still standing, pressed back and back, forced to the very last walls, ready to stand and die for what they beloved. It didn't matter that the empire they were fighting for was a construct of lies and occluded truths. They had endured half a year of horror and grinding onslaught and planetary death in the name of loyalty. And that light and their naivety, this was more tragic than laughable. She had the sudden fiercest urge to be there with them, those exhausted, emaciated, doomed bastards. She wanted to be with them, and what? It's too late for regrets now. Latara shivered, as if the discomfort didn't quite pass. It at least faded. She found herself looking for Karn, but he was nowhere to be seen. The fleet-wide Vox came a moment later, needing to awaken to practiced birth cries of static. The voice of Horus Lupercal cracked across the Conqueror's bridge, as it echoed across every command deck in the Armada. She spoke only 6 words, but for his loyal forces, it was the most they'd heard from the War Master in months. The final assault begins at dawn.